I could have your attention, please. Have your attention, please. Thank you so much for joining us for lunch today. I'd like to turn over our presentation right now to our Executive Director, Chad Dion Lassiter.
Okay, thank you, Gloria. We want to acknowledge the Planning Committee. You worked tirelessly on this since the inception of it, and that's not lost upon us. So we want to have Robert Lindsay, the Regional Director of the Philadelphia Regional Office, if he can come up. And each plaque reads, "The Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission recognizes your participation in the planning of the Fair Housing Equality Conference presented to Robert Lindsay, June 21st, 2023. I'm gonna ask Gloria to step with me. That's yours, sir. And you're in the middle. If we can have Taywan Martinez. Taywan Martinez, who as she's coming, she's been an integral part of a lot of organizing conferences that we've had here at the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission. Hey, baby.
She is cute as can be. Yes, thank you.
Congratulations.
Thank you. In the middle.
You're welcome. Appreciate all that you do. I'm gonna save this one for last. Okay. Could we have Renessa Edwards, another person that's been an integral part of a lot of the organizing of conferences that we've done here at the PHRC. I want to thank her as well.
Thank you very much.
And ironically, your picture just came out.
And look at that. I've been looking at you the whole time. That's so funny. Thank you so much. Thank you. I'm going to give you a hand down. Okay, thank you. I've been with this all day.
And please enjoy the lunch. She's not with us today, but our new Director of Communications, Amanda Brothman, she's done so much with the advisory, the media advisory, the press releases, all of the things that are behind the scenes, in front of the scenes. And so we want to acknowledge her as well. She's on a much needed vacation. Another person who, like Taywan and Renessa and multiple others, is always on the front lines when we're organizing things here at the PHRC on behalf of the people of the Commonwealth, Samantha Lopez.
Thanks, boss. It's quite a step. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Another individual who's just passionate about urban city planning, housing equality, is always sending us articles that are relevant, always recommending books that we need to read. Todd Schwartz.
Hi. Thank you, I appreciate it.
There you go.
Thank you very much.
And then our leader in the fair housing commercial property space, an individual who left his agency about 3 years ago called LHOP, and saw an opportunity to bring his expertise, his passion, his love for all people in the Commonwealth with relations to housing to the Commonwealth, the co-chair of this conference, and just a true advocate for people in the fair housing space, Director Adrian Garcia.
For today's keynote speaker, we have Fred Bañuelos. He is with the Pennsylvania Community Investment Business Development, and he's a business development manager with the Pittsburgh Community Investment. Prior to joining the bank in 2018, Mr. Bañuelos worked for the Harrisburg Housing Authority, always a good experience, where he managed operations for the Housing Choice Voucher Program, Public Housing Program, and Capital Investment. Prior to that, he was the Deputy Director for the Pennsylvania Department of Community and Economic Development and Executive Director at the Alliance for Building Communities, nonprofit affordable housing development corporation. He is a member of several affordable housing organizations, including the Allentown Housing Authority Board of Commissioners, Regional Housing Legal Services, NPC Banking CRA Advisory Committee, the Mid-Atlantic chapter of the National Association of Housing and Redevelopment Officials, the FHLBank Pittsburgh's Diversity and Inclusion Leadership Council. He is also a founding member of the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce of the Lehigh Valley. Please put your hands together and welcome Fred Bañuelos.
Thank you, Gloria, for that warm introduction. I'd also like to thank Executive Director Chad Lassiter and Adrian Garcia for inviting me to be here and speak to you today. It's a wonderful opportunity for me. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Federal Home Loan Bank, some of its affordable housing initiatives, and the importance and impact that it has on some of our communities. Now, since what I'm going to talk about today is going to be given from my point of view, I thought that it would be important for you to learn a little bit about me. So I'm gonna share a little bit about me, and I'm gonna start actually from the very beginning. So again, my name is Fred Bañuelos, and I'm with the Federal Home Loan Bank of Pittsburgh, and I was born in California to proud Mexican parents, and actually at that time I grew up in between both countries, going back and forth. I really didn't know at the time because, you know, as a little kid, you really just don't know where you start and where you end up. And all I knew was that in each side, everybody only spoke Spanish. So I thought I was in the same place the whole time. Just went for a long, long ride. And the reason why we did that was because my mother was originally from Mexico, and my father worked for the Teamsters. And he would be away for quite a bit of time, and my mother didn't feel comfortable being alone, so she took us for months to Mexico to be with her family, close to her siblings and her parents. And it was great. It was great at that time. Again, I grew up oblivious, knowing, you know, which country I was really in, until I hit kindergarten. And there's where my troubles really began. I couldn't speak English. So one of the things that immediately stuck out was the fact that, hey, you know, if I was going to thrive and exist in this country, we were going to have to learn English, myself and my brother. So around that time, we made it a concerted effort within our family for all of us to learn English as we were going to, you know, live here in this country. And my father at the time thought it was important for us to move from California because of some of the racism that was being experienced by Mexicans there. So he moved us to Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. Right? Well, his plan kind of worked. And I'm going to explain a little bit further in my story as to how we ended up in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, but just know that we ended up in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. And his plan kind of worked because there really wasn't a whole lot of racism towards Mexicans in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, because there wasn't any, right? But that's kind of where I proudly now became Puerto Rican. Everybody confused me, and you know what? It was great because I found a new community that I could identify with, And my neighborhood, where we then grew up in, was mostly comprised of black folks and Puerto Ricans, and this is who I went to school with. This is who I played with. This is who I grew up playing sports with. So it was great. It was a great little community, and I found a new home. And I thought that this would be like this for the whole rest of my life. Until, again, we moved. Because when we moved here, we lived in my grandmother's house. And that only lasted but so long before she said she had enough. So we moved over to the north side of Bethlehem, in a less diverse neighborhood. And that was a real eye-opener for us there. In that neighborhood, there was only one other minority family, a black family who again, they were my same age, and we became friends, and to this day, still close friends. But we noticed that we really stuck out within that neighborhood. And we just, continued with what we were doing for a short period of time until my father ultimately passed away, and that was like within that year. Now, within that time, my mother, she was tasked with raising two small Latino males in a foreign country for her, and that was a little bit tough, right? So she had really the thoughts of us being more sided with our family in Mexico, but we were going to school here. This is where our roots have already kind of started. She struggled with a lot of different issues. One of the issues that she struggled with was the issue of race. And she later disclosed to me that when I was being born, when she went to the hospital, she had to fill out a survey asking what her racial background was. And she tried explaining to the nurse or the intake person that as a Mexican, we're kind of multiracial, so that we don't fit in any one clear box. And they really didn't seem to care, didn't really seem to listen. And what they ended up classifying her as was OTW. I don't know how many folks know what OTW stands for. I sure didn't, but it stands for other than white. So that was a real eye-opener for me to hear that. So, again, in growing up, I really wasn't a bad kid, but admittedly, I was a handful. The neighborhood that we were now in, again, I didn't have a whole lot of friends, so I was constantly going all the way back across town to go hang out with my family and with my friends. And when I say all the way across town, I meant the projects, right? That's where we all lived and grew up from. So my mother didn't feel comfortable with that because she was frightened. Again, as all moms are, right? They're protective of their kids. And what was going on at that time, and I'm talking about like the early 80s, the war on drugs. So she was definitely afraid that we would become victims of, drugs. And the reason why was because I had older cousins here. And they were all very heavily involved in drugs. And they were family, and they cared for us, and they invited me to all of their parties, so I was exposed to a lot of stuff at an early age, but they were also very protective. They knew that I was very involved in sports, and while they allowed me to be with them and their friends, they wouldn't allow me to partake in some of the activities they were involved with. They were very careful to make sure that we wouldn't. So they would, and I think a great reason for that was because of a promise they made to my father before he died to really look after us. So I appreciated them for that. And I understand that they made some poor choices. And my mother's concern, I mean, we're talking about, there was some jail time involved here, but they're still family, right? They're still people. They're people that you've spent Christmases, Thanksgivings with. Again, didn't make the best choices, but they were still my family. Still, my mother was a little weary, and at that point, she made a decision to send me to go live in Mexico with her father, my grandfather. That was interesting. I loved it. But again, I grew up primarily here in this country, with different cultures and different influences. But I was well accepted over there. by my family. On this side of my family, on my father's side in the United States, I was the youngest of all the kids. On the other side, I was the oldest. I was the first grandchild. So I got a lot of attention. So I spent like about a year and a half of my high school years there. It was a lot of fun, but then I had to come home. And I came home and I had to graduate from high school, which I did. And eventually I landed up in college. Now, college experience for me was very difficult. The transition was not very easy for me. I was not used to living away from my family and my friends. Those were my support systems. Those were like the constants in my life. And here, I was being dropped off at a university and, with a whole bunch of different folks that I really didn't know. But it gave us an opportunity to meet some new friends. And again, through sports, I played some football in college. So, I got to make some friends actually very, very quickly. But one of the things that stuck out to me very early on upon my arrival at college was that I got called into a meeting, not just myself, but all the other minority students. There wasn't a whole lot up there. This was East Stroudsburg University at the time. And I got called up by the Office of Minority Affairs. And during that meeting, we were told that very few of us would graduate. Asked us to look around, because the guys that we were sitting with weren't going to make it out the other end. That statistically, we stood a better chance of being arrested or incarcerated or dying in a violent crime, rather than obtaining a degree. So that statistic was actually true at that time in the 80s. I hope it changed by now. But socioeconomically, we would not even be able to enjoy the same experiences as our counterparts. So there wouldn't be any spring breaks in Florida for us. And the penalties for underage drinking or parties would be harsher than it would be for our counterparts. And that one I did get to experience and see firsthand. I saw several friends get in trouble. I got expelled from school, while counterparts had parents that got attorneys, fought it, and got to stay. So all this was very sobering to me at that time. I understood why they were telling us this. They saw us as having potential, and they wanted to point out some of the pitfalls that we would be facing, in going to this college experience, but that we needed to be mindful that the college experience was going to be different from us. I get it. I get it now. At the time, I was still just a kid, and I didn't know why I was being singled out. But either way, I ended up graduating college, and after working summers in construction, I eventually got my real estate license and worked for a close friend of mine's stepfather, who owned his own real estate company. I then shortly married afterwards and was raising my family. And again, I was selling real estate, working construction jobs on the side, and actually doing for what I estimated was very well for myself. However, my friend's father, he saw a little more in me, and he insisted that I work at our local housing authority, where he was the chairman of that housing authority. Now, he arranged for me to get a job interview. Well, he actually arranged for me to get a job. All I had to do really was show up. But I didn't, because there was a caveat to it. You had to pass a civil service exam to get hired. And the executive director told him, he said, hey, because he followed up with the executive director, and his name was Frank. He said, hey, Frank, where are we at with Fred? He said, well, I'll take him any day, but, he needs that civil service exam. And Bill got back to Bill, and Bill got back to me and said, hey, did you even take this exam? And I said, no, look, I'm kind of comfortable here. He said, but you don't have a pension. You don't have benefits. You don't have health benefits. You have a small family, a young family. He said, you can't just keep doing this. So he convinced me. This was wise advice. Again, I lost my father at a very early age. I didn't have anybody to explain these things to me or look out for me. But I took his advice. I took the civil service exam, got the second highest score in the state. I don't know how that happened, but it did. And I started my career there at the Bethlehem Housing Authority. Great job, great organization, but eventually I grew bored there. It was a little too easy. It was a little too accommodating. So I started getting involved in the trade, in the trade magazines, and I started reading about different things that were happening all over the country, meaning tax credit development. It started to flourish like around that time. So I thought that I would be wise and sit down and meet with my executive director, even though at that time I was the youngest employee. But I figured I would sit down and pitch a proposal to him to say, hey, why can't we start doing tax credit development here in Bethlehem? And he looked at me and he just said, Fred, you got to understand that to do that, it is a very long and slow process. Progress is very slow. To which point I looked at him and I said, hey, Frank, whoever said progress was a slow process wasn't talking about me. He didn't get the reference, and I know some of these guys didn't, but it was the 90s, right? And I'll explain after this. But I was very ambitious at the time, right? I wanted to make something happen. So again, not satisfied, I went back and I got all my credentials in order. I had my degree already. I figured, okay, I got everything I need to be an executive director here. Now, Frank Loretti was 70 years old at the time. And I figured, this guy's going to be retiring. This is a perfect spot for me to come in and land and do this in my mid-20s. And Frank Loretti was very straightforward. He really liked me, particularly because I had a boxing background. He absolutely loved boxing, so he would always talk to me about boxing. But he gave me his honest opinion and his honest truth on this. And he told me, Fred, I think that you would make a wonderful executive director, except for the fact that we're in civil service, and everybody ahead of you is going to get that job before you. So mathematically, this doesn't even work out for you. He said, the only way you're going to be an executive director is if you leave. So I was a little perplexed and kind of hurt, to be honest with you, because now my boss just kind of said, hey, you got to go. You have no future here. And I'm thinking, wow, I'm doing everything right. I have my college degree, which some of my counterparts didn't. I have all my credentials. I have good ideas, but I can't stay here. This doesn't make any sense. But it was a reality, and it was a truth. So 9 months later, I interviewed for a job with an affordable housing development corporation. And one of the first things that they asked for was my experience and background in tax credits. And I had to honestly answer and say, hey, look, I have none. And if I told you I did, I'd be lying to you because nobody's doing it around here. So unless I came from Colorado or California or somewhere else, you can't get that experience here. And they appreciated the answer and said, well, would you like to learn? And I answered absolutely. And I did. Eventually, I ended up taking over as executive director for that organization. And I ran that organization. We did numerous tax credit deals. We did 202 deals. We did home ownership deals, home ownership counseling. We got involved in everything. Anything that I could figure out and find out, we were trying to do, right? Like I said, I was very ambitious. The first call that I got was from my previous executive director, congratulating me and telling me how right he was, which I thought was kind of ironic, but I appreciated the call. Now, around that time, because of the development that I was doing and the attention I was bringing to the organization, I was invited by the Federal Home Loan Bank of Pittsburgh to sit on what's called their Affordable Housing Advisory Committee. And I'm going to go into this in greater detail in a little bit. But basically what it was leading developers throughout the state of Pennsylvania, Delaware, and West Virginia. And basically what they were asking us was our opinion on market conditions and how they could set policy. So at the time, I really just focused on it was a paid board, which I never was a part of before, and I just kind of accepted on that alone. But it was an enriching experience that led and opened more doors later on in the future. At that time, I was also involved with other CRA boards. Just about every bank was merging. I don't know if you guys remember the predecessors of Bank of America as Summit Bank, Fleet Bank, Wells Fargo was First Union, Wachovia. Every time that happened, they needed community development folks to sit on their CRA boards. So I got invited to be a part of all of that and very heavily involved at that time. But during my 9-year tenure with the council, and as you heard earlier, I worked at the Department of Community and Economic Development as Deputy Director under the Rendell administration. I ended up then ultimately at the Harrisburg Housing Authority, and there I got an opportunity to work with an excellent executive director. And if you don't know him, I would encourage you to make an effort to go out and meet him. His name is Sangor Mans, one of the most progressive housing authority executive directors that you could have out there. I was his vice president, he was the president CEO. And together we ran an organization that was one of the most diverse in the housing world. We did some excellent things there together, and we're talking now about a housing authority that was run by both Black and Latino leadership. Unheard of at the time, never seen. But we did wonders for our staff and for our residents. And I emphasize residents because that's really what it was all about. We needed to give them an opportunity to interact with folks that not only understood them, could sympathize with them, but actually looked like them. So I did all of that, but it came at an expense to me because, as you all know, I lived in Allentown in the Lehigh Valley, so my commute was an hour and a half each way, which was a little tough on me and my young family. And that's why when the Federal Home Loan Bank contacted me about an opportunity to come work with them, I had to make a hard choice. And I gotta be honest with you, it actually hurt me to leave Sangor and the Harrisburg Housing Authority. We're still very close friends to this day, and I help them however I can. But I really miss that organization, and I really miss being able to work with and for Sangor. But I joined another good organization here in the Federal Home Loan Bank, and I landed in their community investment team. And I guess right now, you're probably all wondering what business I had joining a bank without having any kind of bank experience. Because up to now, I'm all housing, right? Well, I'm going to explain. So, how many people are familiar with the Federal Home Loan Bank of Pittsburgh? Oh, quite a few. That's good. That's encouraging. Most people don't understand the Federal Home Loan Bank and the Federal Home Loan banking system. So I'm going to give you 3 points that, if nothing else, you could walk away with this. Number 1, we are not the federal government. I have nothing to do with them. Number 2, we don't provide home loans. And number 3, we're not even a bank. So you can see how I'm starting to fit in now, right? But what we are is actually a government-sponsored enterprise that was established by Congress in 1932, kind of like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And throughout the country, there are 11 regional banks. So the Federal Home Loan Bank of Pittsburgh covers Pennsylvania, Delaware, and West Virginia. And all our counterparts cover the whole rest of the country. We are a cooperative. Now, for us in particular, it's close to 300 member financial institutions. And when I say financial institutions, they are banks, insurance companies, CDFIs, community development financial institutions, and or thrifts. Across the country, there are 6,500 members that fall into the Federal Home Loan banking system. Now, our main job is to provide access to liquidity and collateral to these members that I just mentioned. Now, in 1989, under the Financial Institutions Reform, Recovery, and Enforcement Act, and that was passed to reform the financial industry during the wake of the savings and loan crisis. I don't know if anybody remembers that, but there needed to be some reform there. They led to the creation of what's called the Affordable Housing Program. And this is where they mandated and said that 10% of your net earnings for each Federal Home Loan Bank has to go back out to community development and community development endeavors, particularly affordable housing. So you see how I'm starting to fit in now a little bit more, right? Initially, there was pushback from the banking industry. They didn't want to do this, and they kind of figured out a way to make money off of it. So they did this in the form of advances, loans, rather than grants. But over time, they were heavily criticized by the regulators, and eventually, over time, this turned into a grant program, how it exists today. The Affordable Housing Program is actually a grant program. Now, we started a down payment and closing cost assistance program in 1996 called First Front Door Program. And that assists first-time home buyers who are folks at 80% or below of the area median income obtain assistance in getting their first home. That was pretty novel at the time, and that's actually a carve-out of our affordable housing program. In 2000, we started another program called Banking on Business, and that was to help support small businesses. What we do is we provide secondary financing for small businesses that have a hard time either getting collateral or loan to value, and this gives these deals a second chance. Very successful program. I'm highlighting these three particular programs. We have a couple others because it's going to lead to more during my talk here. So, as I mentioned, the Affordable Housing Program, which is the flagship program for the Federal Home Loan Bank, is really used for the development of affordable housing and has been supporting rental and home ownership projects since its inception. We fund everything from very complicated tax credit deals, being gap financing there, all the way to single projects. Nationally, we are the largest funder for the Habitat for Humanity system. Yeah, I was pretty shocked to hear that one. Now, to give you a little bit of impact, I'm going to tell you about, since our inception, we awarded $380 million, leveraging a total investment of $4 billion, resulting in the creation of 39,000 homes. That's what we've managed to do with our HP project. With the down payment one, the First Front Door that I mentioned, we've awarded $91 million, leveraging $2.4 billion, and creating 20,000 first-time home buyer opportunities there. Thank you. And then for Bob, we awarded $93 million, leveraging $587 million, helping 997 businesses and creating 12,000 jobs. Now, I highlight those impacts because this is going to bring us to our newest endeavors. And this is really what I wanted to share and talk with everybody about. So, one of the things that we do at the Federal Home Loan Bank is every 5 years, we do what's called a housing needs assessment. We go out into the footprints that we serve, which are Delaware, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia, and we do a survey of what the local needs are. We do that so that we could help set some policy here. Along with the Affordable Housing Advisory Committee, we take their input, and then we start deciding how we make awards and how we value our point system in getting these grants awarded. So, during this housing needs assessment that occurred now going on 3 years, there were a couple things that really stuck out to us. And the first one was the high degree of need for minority home ownership, right? That's no secret. It's been in the papers, but as all organizations have to, we have to document these things. So we did. We did it within our housing needs assessment. The other thing that we noted was that there was disparity in being able to get funding for small minority businesses and women-owned businesses. So finding these two things out, we took action. And again, at this time, over the past couple of years, we had a real call to arms for our diversity, equity, and inclusion endeavors within the bank. And what we ended up doing is we ended up landing on what's called a special purpose credit program. Now, for those that aren't familiar with what a special purpose credit program is, it sets out unique standards and benefits to make loan qualifications easier for people who are from an underserved population. It's also expressly authorized by the federal or state law for the benefit of economically disadvantaged class of persons. So we did this, and we started with our first program, the Banking on Business program, right? So the Banking on Business program took a carve-out now, and we initiated what was now called the Banking on Business Inclusion and Equity Fund. And there we targeted minority and women-owned businesses. This occurred last year. It's been successfully run. We're in our second round. And we've enjoyed a high degree of success. We've helped a tremendous amount of small businesses there within our communities. Now, starting a special purpose credit program takes a lot of time and a lot of resources. We had to actually hire attorneys to write our plan and compile all of the research to get it to go by our regulators, and again, to comply with federal and state law. But it can be done, and it should be done. In the end, it was all worth it. We were the first federal home loan bank in the system to develop a special purpose credit program. So we were very proud of that distinction. Now, this year, we're working on our second special purpose credit program, and that is to tackle the issue of equity in minority home ownership. Remember, that was the second thing that we found. So, before I get into the specifics of what we're proposing, I want to share a story of how impact home ownership could be. And the short story I'm going to share is the story of a lady called Matiana Gonzalez. She was my paternal grandmother. Now, most people's memories of their grandparents, or grandmothers, I should say, are these cute little old ladies that are very loving and will give you a cookie and, read you stories, whatever the case may be. But that was not my grandma. My grandma was tough. She was bitter, and she was often angry. So I just tried to stay out of her way as much as possible, right? But I never understood why, right? Because on my mom's side, I had my other grandmother that was the polar opposite. And on this side, I had a lady that was just, I don't know, a handful. Not just to me, but to her children, to the neighbor, to everybody. So, we went through life, and as an adult, I made it a point to try to find out. I had to sit down, and I had to ask her story, which I don't want to say I regret, but you got to hear the story. So, as an adult, I sat down with her in Mexico, where she ultimately ended up, and I knew that my father's death was a toll on her. He was her youngest child. So I thought in my mind I might have attributed it to some of the bitterness. I was always told, my father was the youngest of 8 children, so she had a lot of kids, right? And please remember that number, 8 children. We're going to get back to that in a minute. So in Mexico, I decided to ask her about her life. And again, as I mentioned, I was not prepared to hear her story at all. She was born in a very small town, village, so to speak, in Mexico. She was orphaned and being raised by her uncle. So school wasn't an option. She was impoverished and was just, had that sustenance living, right? Her memory was at 15, one of her fondest memories, I should say, was at 15, she remembered having a boyfriend. But that was short-lived because within a short period of time, she was abducted as a child bride at 15 by a man that was 10 years her senior. So he took her by horse and train all the way up to Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, right? She couldn't read or write. She couldn't leave even if she wanted to. She didn't know where she was in the world. So she was beholden to where she had to be with now 3 young children. She bore 3 young children to this man. Eventually, he left, but he left her living there because at the time, well, let me go back a little bit for the Bethlehem Steel. The Bethlehem Steel recruited Mexicans to work in their coke works because they felt that they could withstand the heat, extreme heat, better than anyone else, right? So that's how my family and other Mexican families ended up in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. Now, they had what was called labor camps, and that's where they lived. The labor camps were dirt floors, no heat. She told me she had a coal stove to heat the house, right? So This story was getting worse, as it progressed. I'm starting to understand. It's like, wow, she was raped over time. She had children to this guy. He ended up leaving her. She's stuck with 3 kids, and in substandard housing. So then, around that time, my grandfather, he was a professional soccer player. He ended up in Reading, Pennsylvania, and defected because he heard they were hiring in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. He ends up meeting my grandmother, and they proceeded to have 10 more children, right? But now, that's 13, right? It's not 8, like I knew. I accounted for 8. So now I'm like, wait a minute. Where are the other 5? And this is where the story gets deep. He's like, right? So she had to give one of her children away. I never met that aunt. She went to go live in Mexico. She lived a long time, but I never coincided. There was no way for me to figure out where she lived or even meet her. And then the other 4, she disclosed to me, and the manner that she disclosed it to me was that the house took them. And I'm like, what house, and how did they take them? Again, dirt floors, drafty conditions, and these children were born in wintertime, and they died. They died in her labor camp, right? So this lady is not having an easy life. To top it off, my grandfather was abusive. He beat her and ended up leaving her. So now he left her with that many more kids, right? So it was tough. But through it all, she had perseverance. Again, I'm telling you, this was a tough lady, right? She managed to save up enough money and buy a house. And that's the house that I got to know when I came from California. The reason why I'm outlining this is because for her, this house represented a way to provide life to her family. It wasn't an opportunity. It wasn't a place to sleep. It wasn't anything else. She equivocated living with having a home. Up until then, and I spent my career in housing, I've heard stories about, being homeless and not having a place to stay, couch surfing, but I never heard of anybody dying in a house, or that people were afraid that they wouldn't live if they didn't have a house. So the death of her babies are what really initiated her and motivated her to own her first house. Now, that story for me, that left a lasting impression. It changed the way not only that I looked at her, but as how I looked at my career, as to what I do, as to the purpose of what I do, and how impactful it could be, and how it might mean just something that important to someone else. So I now had a duty to make sure that I help these other folks as they try to get their home. So, again, for some, it might be taken for granted to have a house and a place to live, but for others, quite literally, it's the difference between life and death. So, again, that was a pretty extreme story about minority home ownership. But again, for many, it's difficult to partake in the American dream. We have suffered through prohibitive policies over time that have left long-lasting and negative impacts on our communities. And right now, I'm specifically talking about redlining. For those that aren't sure about that, it was a practice back in 1930s, and where they color-coded maps, and they told banks where to invest or not to invest, to provide mortgages or not to provide mortgages. Those effects and those policies have had left lasting effects to this day. Now, while it is illegal today to do that practice, if you just go and overlay another map of healthcare facilities, failing school districts, increased crime, Food deserts, you're going to find the same map, right? Because all of these things are lacking in those communities today. So while we made the practice illegal many years ago, we haven't really made too much advancement to date. We need to do better. We need better policy to help us get ahead. But now, for us, the Federal Home Loan Bank, in an effort to generate some of the equity around the issue, we in Pittsburgh, we're currently in the process of developing our second special purpose credit program. And this one now is around minority home ownership. That's where I took that pause before I told you that story, right? So this special purpose credit program is going to be in the form of down payment and closing cost assistance. And it's going to be offered to minority borrowers as defined by the HMDA Housing Mortgage Disclosure Act. And we're going to propose to target households between 80% and 115% of the area median income. Because for a lot of minorities, there are no programs like that at that income range, right? We always only ever focus on the lower income, but we have all kinds of income. So we need to make sure that we provide opportunities for everyone. So the proposed grant amount is probably going to be somewhere around the $15,000 range, which is pretty substantial. Right now, there's others that, $3,000, $5,000, but $15,000 is now something that's, impactful and hopefully make a difference. And we hope that this program is going to be equally as successful as our other one, but we realize that this is only one part of the equity-generating solution. There are still many barriers that minorities face in residential lenders, and I'm going to just mention a few, highlight a couple of them. And that is outreach, underwriting, rising interest rates now, and most importantly, low inventory. So while we're starting to come with solutions, now we're providing products to borrow and find and use a home, there's no homes to be bought. So we got to do better there. We all got to put our minds collectively together and figure out a solution as to how we're going to be able to create this inventory for folks. Because that's the biggest barrier that I found. Now, today, I told you a couple stories. I probably disclosed more about myself than I have to many folks. But I want to touch on a couple of the themes that I touched today. So I'm going to recap them. So if you think back on what I just said a couple moments ago, I talked about health. I talked about housing. I talked about race. I talked about domestic violence. I talked about immigration, and I talked about education, right? This is just one story. You all got stories. Now, I left one last detail about myself, and I did it intentionally because I wanted to end on this note. And that is one of the motivators. So I told you a little bit about myself, how I got involved in housing and what I do and how I am where I'm at. But one of the most important reasons why I'm here and why I'm doing and involved in affordable housing is because of my desire to serve and help others. And that's very similar to all of you. So spiritually, it's all within our calling. That's what we do. That's our mission. That's what we're supposed to do. And we're often asked to provide examples showing the difference between equity and equality. And I'm going to end on this one, of what it means for me and my analogy. So the best analogy that I've been able to come up with, and again, I'm going to start taking us to church now, is number one, God loves us all equally, right? But he's given us all different gifts and circumstances, and therein lies equity. He didn't give us all the same stuff, but he loves us all the same, and he's given us that equity. So I hope you found this information and stories to be useful as you think about providing your equity-generating ideas in the work that you do. And I'll be available for questions, after this. And however I can help you with your mission or what you're doing, be more than happy to do so.
Oh, come on, you could do better than that. Give him another round. I'm going to ask E.D. Lassiter to come up to this podium one more time, if you would, please. Fred, we want to recognize you with a token of our appreciation for taking the time to bring your message, your story, and your identity, and your being, and sharing it, and exposing it. It's not easy to talk about yourself and where you come from. And when you hear someone do that, in the context of what we're trying to deliver and what we're trying to talk about, it lets you know the kind of person they are and where they're coming from when they're in this mission, a mission that we all share. So Fred, this one just says, the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission recognizes your dedication in fighting for fair housing, equality for all. So Fred Bañuelos. Thank you. All right, so you have a little bit of time. Please, if you haven't partaken of the Photos 360 booth, do so. And we'll get started promptly at 1 o'clock in the session. We have a breakout session in the concourse, and we also have a breakout session in the Dell Theater where we were this morning. So if you haven't taken advantage of the 360 bush, do so now, and then we'll see you downstairs promptly at 1 o'clock. Thank you. 2 o'clock. 2 o'clock.